main scholarship areas are the American presidency, modern political ideology, and public budgeting and finance. Professor Merrifield has been an annual lecturer in the War and Peace lecture series for over 20 years. Most of that time he has discussed topics of how government secrecy and intelligence gathering in democratic countries, approaching this both as part of the role of government agencies and also democracy and political ideology. And we've, over the last year, I know this has always been our job, but we think this is a vital lecture. We've asked him to start our lecture series on this because it really underscores everything else. The connection between what we know. That's why we're encouraging you guys to pursue alternative media and stay abreast of the news that's going on, because if you don't know what's going on, get yourself informed about that. Democracy can't work. So please join us in welcoming Professor Merrifield to talk about that stuff.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As to background, what I'm going to try and accomplish today is the purpose of the presentation is to look at the tension between democracy and secrecy. To do that, I want to look a little bit at the general principles of what makes up a democratic society. I also want to look at the role of espionage, intelligence gathering, etc., in the historical sense of the polity, how political systems have used it. And there's always been an assumed necessity of intelligence gathering and spying. I want to approach it from the standpoint of, is this a necessary tension? I also want to weigh the pluses and minuses of what secrecy has done to democracy in the United States today. Where are we now? I recently saw an article that I didn't even get a chance to fully read, but it said using 8 or 9 normal criteria for democracy that the United States has almost none of them left. But that's a position that is worth contemplating and is neither self-evidently true nor self-evidently false. And then finally, after we talk a little bit about that, I want to have some time for questions and discussion. As Tim just said, I've been doing this with the War and Peace stuff for over 20 years, and I've spent most of the last of those years talking specifically about the role of intelligence gathering in a democratic society. The last time I missed happened to be Tuesday, September 11th, 2001 was actually on Tuesday. I was writing the lecture that morning when the airplanes flew into the buildings in New York City and the side of the Pentagon, and then the one that crashed in Pennsylvania. That class was canceled because the government of the state at the time was absolutely convinced that terror was everywhere. Okay, so everything got closed down at the State University that day. And essentially, we really have to move from that position September 11, 2001. We are wandering around. I must admit, I had a New Yorker cartoon in about 5 or 6 weeks after the attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and Northern Virginia. There was a really nice New Yorker cartoon that I had on my door for several years until somebody tore it down and threw it away. And it just showed 2 guys in suits knocking on a door in a middle-class neighborhood, shining badges saying, "Hi, we're from the FBI and we're going door to door to make sure you're all scared shitless." And in a sense, that's where we have been for the last 13 or 14 years. But one of the things I've been reading about in the last couple of months, or a couple of different book reviews and some articles, raises the question not about where we are today, but the broader question is any level of secrecy really that important? In other words, does espionage, intelligence gathering, and spying get us very much? I think it's a intriguing question, because it means that what I've been arguing for the last 20 years is espionage is an assumed necessity for all governments. And this raises the question about the relative value of secrecy. The basis of the liberal democratic state, and liberal in the sense I'm using the word, is factual. The United States is a liberal democracy. It's based on certain principles associated with liberal democracy. I'm not using the word in the sense that you hear it on Fox News or George H.W. Bush, who used to call it the L word, to equate liberalism with the word shit or something. I'm just, we are a liberal democracy. That is factual. I think even some of the right-wing commentators who may not like it very much would admit that that was true. So when I talk about liberal democracy, I talk about certain principles that go into creating a state. The U.S. evolved its political ideas, evolved its political institutions and political theories from modern political thought. And by modern political thought, I mean modern in the sense of post-medieval or Renaissance thought. So when I talk about modern political ideas, I'm talking about ideas that have been around essentially as important ideas and expanding ideas for the last 300 to 350 years. Okay, so we're not talking about modern in the sense of the last 10 or 15 years. So we are a modern liberal democracy in that sense. Overwhelmingly, the great American political thinkers, okay, are evolutionary and derivative. In other words, we don't have any of the great political thinkers of history who are not Americans. Okay, Thomas Jefferson was a very, very thoughtful guy, a derivative political thinker. Probably his most famous work that he's given the most credit for is the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will note that the Declaration of Independence structurally looks almost exactly like the Declaration of the Rights of Englishmen of 1689, which was associated with John Locke. Okay? Thomas Jefferson talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke talked about life, liberty, and the state. Okay? Which just virtually superimposed these liberal ideas. And he did this in the sense that our political system is primarily evolved out of British political system and British political ideas. Though we also were influenced by some of the French and some others as well. And out of these ideas, there are a number of key points that are necessary to understand what a liberal democracy is supposed to look like. First of all, a liberal democracy is based on a social contract. Okay? And a social contract is an idea that government is created by equals. Okay? Previous to the social contract, government was established by the idea that there were better and lesser. Okay? And that the better people should rule and the lesser should obey. Okay? And the lesser could expect a certain amount of protection from their betters. But there was no equal relationship. Okay? So in medieval thought, you had lieges and you had lords. Okay? Well, the social contract is based on the idea that we are all born equal to each other. Okay? And in thinking about our equality, we can go back to Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes really defined us as all equal because the weakest can kill the strongest. Okay? So nobody is more powerful than anybody else. Okay? And we can be, years ago there was a rather bad movie that got some decent press. When former Governor Schwarzenegger starred with Danny DeVito as a biological experiment that went wrong. They were twins. And so you have Arnold Schwarzenegger, the muscle-bound oaf, and you've got Danny DeVito, the small, squat, slightly misshapen hustler. Okay? But no one can doubt that with a gun, Danny DeVito can kill Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? So at the basic level, we're all equal. Okay? Because in society, before we have society, in the state of nature, right? Everybody is equal in the sense that we all can have the capacity to kill each other. The social contract comes about because the state of nature is not a good place to live, right? Because in the state of nature, there's a couple of you sitting in the corner. Okay, you're the safest you're going to get in the state of nature. Because nobody can sneak up behind you and smack your head in and steal your stuff, right? Because in the state of nature, life is dangerous and short, nasty and brutish. Okay? So, to live a better life, according to Thomas, we collectively come out of the state of nature. And when we come out of the state of nature, we give up certain things to each other. Okay? I give up my right to bash you on the head. You give up your right to bash me on the head. We establish a collective to prevent people from hurting and killing each other. Okay? Because fear of violent death is the single greatest urge, according to Hobbes. Okay, it's not a very optimistic worldview, but think about it for a while. Right? And government is primarily about the reduction or the minimization of risk. Okay? But what makes the social contract different than earlier governmental forms is we did this voluntarily as equals. Okay? So we created a social contract. The primary social contract as a governmental document in the United States is the Constitution of 1787. Constitution. And you read the preamble, it says, we the people. It doesn't say the states established. It doesn't say the government established. It says, we the people got together and decided to build a better government through a social contract. So that's the first ingredient of a modern liberal state. Secondarily, a second principle is constitutionalism. Okay? Constitutionalism is a belief that there are certain values in the political structure and it should not be susceptible to panic. Okay? And what I mean by that is when we get afraid, we tend to act irrationally, right? Most of you are actually too young to remember at any kind of very advanced age, right? What happened on September 11, 2001. But for those of you who do, or those of you who have read about it, okay, within a matter of hours, people were running around talking about it. We ought to burn down all the mosques. We ought to round up all brown people who looked vaguely like they might be from the Middle East. We equated all Arabs with Muslims and all Muslims with Arabs. Okay, and all of it is dangerous. And we started talking about their civil liberties and rounding them up, as we did the Japanese Americans in World War II. Okay, irrational behavior. Okay, constitutionalism says there are certain principles, okay, that supersede the urges of the populace. I mean, sometimes we don't think very well. Okay, so constitutionalism says just because something happens that freaks you out, you can't go around shooting everybody who you think looks maybe like somebody who might have done something to you, right? Presumption of innocence is something that doesn't go away because we become afraid. Freedom of speech doesn't go away because we become afraid, okay? So these are overarching rules of society that can only be changed with incredible difficulty. Okay? And that's intentional. Because we know we're not always at our best when we are afraid. And we know that we behave badly sometimes when we become afraid or we run amok. A third principle beyond constitutionalism and the social contract is popular sovereignty. Okay? Popular sovereignty simply means that ultimately the society is ruled, the sovereign of society is the king. Okay? Now, as I'll point out in a few minutes, none of these things automatically demand democracy. Okay? You will hear in countries say, I rule on behalf of the people and I get my strength from the people. And if you don't like it, I'm going to put you against the wall and shoot you, or I'm going to put you in jail, etc., because I'm doing it for the greater good. And I'm selected by God, or I'm selected by some other leader, etc. Okay, but you can claim popular sovereignty. But ultimately, the liberal state assumes that the government is essentially beholden to the sovereign, and the sovereign is us. And tied to all of this is, therefore, if we are the sovereigns, is consent to the government. Okay? We get to decide whether society is legitimate. Okay? And any society that doesn't obey, or any government that doesn't obey the popular will, lacks the consent of the government. These ideas and ideals overlap, and there are other ones associated also with the modern liberal state, but these are primary ones. There's another one that we never write up that is also inherent in our thinking, and that's the right to revolution. Okay? Because the social contract says we, the citizens, give up certain rights to the state. In exchange, the state does certain things for us. Okay? The primary function of the state is to protect us. Okay? Protect us, whether it's internal security, protect us against environmental degradation, protect us against the enemy without, etc. But the reason we give up the power to kill our neighbors when we're angry at them is the state is supposed to protect us from the bad behavior of our neighbors. Okay? If the state systematically fails to protect us, okay, they side with the oppressor instead of siding with the oppressed, at some point the contract is null and void. Okay, if the contract becomes null and void, we not only have a right, we have an obligation to eliminate the contract. Okay, I just talked about the Declaration of Independence. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. Okay? I mean, if you read it, it is, we had a deal with the British Crown. The British Crown systematically abused the deal. We're breaking the deal. We're creating a new country, a new government. And then it's a list of all the things that the British have done that amounts to a violation of the social contract. Okay, so we have a right to revolution, too. You will rarely find that in governmental documents. Okay, the government will say, the state can do this, the state can do this, the individual can do this, the individual can do this. It never says, and by the way, if you don't know what we're doing, overthrow us. Okay, you can read all the way through the Constitution. The best we got is the amendment process, okay, which is a little short of that. Okay, but there's only one real justification for revolution anyway, right? Success. Okay, because if you are a successful revolutionary, you are a patriot. If you're an unsuccessful revolutionary, you're a traitor. Okay, and treason is the only criminal sanction in the Constitution. I mean, they say what it is. So these things overlap, and over the course of time, consent of the government, popular sovereignty, the social contract, and even constitutionalism lead pretty inevitably and logically to democracy. What's the best way to measure the consent of the government? Ask. Okay? What's the best way to ensure popular sovereignty, that the people rule? Let the people select the leadership. Okay, so this is how we get to a somewhat democratic state, but I want to go a little deeper into this because democracy needs more exploration. Basically, democracy is just two Greek words slammed together. Demos, the people, kratia, rule. Okay, kratia, there can be various kinds of rule. Autocracy, rule by the one. Okay. Theocracy, ruled by religious leadership. Okay. The United States has allegiance to democracy, ruled by the people. Now, there are various structures that make up democratic governments. Most democratic governments rely on representative government. Okay. Rather than the people ruling directly, they rule indirectly through people they have selected to rule as their agents or representatives. Now, plebiscitary democracy exists. That's democracy by plebiscite, where we just decide what we're going to do by voting en masse. And how we vote is the way it becomes and it works out. It isn't used too frequently. It's not used very successfully. All of California, with our referendum initiative process, just adores plebiscitary democracy, where we go out and vote for propositions. Okay, and as I say, we generally do it rather badly because in a state with 40 million people, where it takes $35 or $40 million to run a successful television campaign to accomplish anything through direct democracy of the people, in reality, it's usually propaganda by those who can afford lots of television time. And it leads to all kinds of bizarre and insane ideas, and occasionally something good comes of it as well. Another form of democracy is the direct town hall meeting style. Okay, where the people come together and decide what policy is going to be in a meeting. This is done rarely and can work with a certain level of success in very, very small political entities. Okay? There are still towns in New England that the people get together about twice a year and basically actually decide policy rather than selecting people to decide policy for them, and then they select people to carry out policy. There are fewer and fewer of those because as cities and towns get bigger, and maybe because we get busier, this is less frequent. So generally when we think of democracy as representative government. Okay? And in a representative government, we are all the rulers as citizens, but our role as citizens is limited. Okay? Primarily, the most important thing a citizen can do, and this is the one that most of us do if we participate at all, is to vote. Okay? That's where we exercise our greatest potential power. And beyond the vote, there's a lot of other things we can do as well. Higher levels of political participation through various forms of activism. We can belong to political parties. We can participate in political campaigns. We can join free associations to try and influence the political process. And those free associations can be any number of things, from relatively small political groups that are trying to decide whether the city of Cotati should have roundabouts or four-way stops. You can form committees because you don't like roundabouts, you like four-way stops. Or you don't like four-way stops, you want roundabouts, and the committees on that. Or you can have gigantic free associations that have much greater influence. And the largest political free association, non-governmental agency with the political agenda in the United States is the Catholic Church. Okay, millions and millions of members with a strong political agenda, though because they are so diverse, they're not particularly effective considering their size, but they can't be ignored either. So there's lots of different ways to participate. Running for office obviously is the most highest level of participation. In the United States, there's more elected officials than any other country in the world. We've got 250,000 elected officials in the United States, of which the vast majority of them are on local school boards. But everybody from the President of the United States to a member of the local school board is an elected official. But even with 250,000, the vast majority of people never participate in politics at the level of actually running for something. So it's our vote that really matters. And the election process validates our system and it validates our action. Okay? So if we vote for people to run the city council in Cacadia, Robert Park, or Santa Rosa, or wherever you're from, okay, and they do a number of dumb things, it's sort of on us, right? Because we voted for it. However, for voting to matter, voting has to be in fair elections. Okay? And a fair election has a couple of ingredients that make it fair. Okay? They've got to be honest elections. Right? That the ballots actually get counted correctly. Okay? And the process has to be open. So it's not only important that the ballots get counted fairly, it's important that we believe the ballots get counted fairly. Okay? Because there's no legitimacy if you believe the election is fraudulent. Okay? We have no allegiance to a fraudulent government except one. Right? I mean, why do we obey bad laws? Why do we obey bad government? They got guns. Right? I mean, the power of the state can come from the legitimacy. We obey laws because we think the laws are reasonable, just, and even if we disagree with them, we thought, well, you know, I think you guys are all idiots. Okay? For legalizing marijuana, but you want to legalize marijuana? Okay. It's legitimate because the process was legitimate. Or we can obey the state because if you don't, they got guns. Okay? They can put you in jail. They can hurt you. One is legitimate, and that tends to be authority. One is power. And you can run a state for a long time without legitimacy, provided you have the power, but it's not a fair system. Well, if we're going to be fair, honest, and open, okay, the people who vote have to have some idea that what they're voting on is real, right? So we talk about the consent of the government, but the consent of the government is only open and true and fair consent, okay, if we really have informed consent, right? I mean, many of you may be renting places while you're in school, or renting places now, you know, whatever, right? And you sign a rental contract, and the rental contract says you're going to give the landlord this amount of dough every month to stay where you are. And for that, you get, you know, a roof that doesn't leak, windows that close, a minimum amount of vermin that you should be aware of, etc. Right? And if the person renting you the place lies, now the shower always works. You always got hot water. Okay? And you never do. Okay? Well, your stuff's not going to get wrecked because the ceiling isn't going to leak. And it does. Right? You wouldn't have signed that contract. And if they lied knowingly, right? It's a fraudulent contract. There was no informed consent. Okay? Without informed consent, you have an invalid contract. Therefore, people must have access to a truthful government so they can decide whether what the government is doing is what they want it to do. So when the government consistently lies to you, when the government consistently withholds information from you, okay, Instead of voting for reality, you are voting for some fantasy that they have created. You are not an informed voter. I'm not talking about the person who ignores the information. I'm talking about the person who goes out and seeks the information, and the information they get is just not valid. Okay? The government lacks legitimacy. Then you obey the government out of fear of the power of the government, as opposed to obeying the government because the government deserves your respect for it because you believe that it is legitimately in power. So, free speech, free press, free pursuit of information is fundamental to democracy because without it you don't have informed consent. Okay? Because there's only a few laws of political science. Okay? And two of them are vitally important to understand. By laws, I mean there are no exceptions. Okay, I've spent a long time thinking about this and studying this and looking for exceptions. And it seems to me there are two laws of political science. Okay, one is associated with Lord Acton, the British thinker of the 19th century, that said all power corrupts. And absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you're on the school board or the President of the United States. Over time, the threat of corruption is there. Okay? The danger of the corruption varies with the amount of power that you have, but we all are susceptible to corruption if we have power. Okay? And the other thing that I believe is law is what's known as the iron law of oligarchy. Okay? Oligarchy means ruled by a few. And the iron law of oligarchy says that virtually every organization, no matter how democratic it starts out to be, eventually a few people in power end up making a vast majority of the decision making. Okay? And the iron law of oligarchy says that those in power tend to make decisions for the benefit of those in power. Okay? So we have to fight corruption because all power will lead to corruption. And we have to be aware that every organization tends to centralize power for the benefit of the people who wield power. The best defense we have against both of those is the antiseptic value of a free press and free speech. Okay? In other words, screaming at the powerful and screaming about the powerful so the rest of us will be aware. And then we can decide what we want to do. But if those in power have control of the information, and they have a tendency towards corruption, and they have a tendency to having a small cabal making the decisions, the likelihood is they're going to work to their benefit rather than to our benefit. Intelligence gathering, on the other hand, looking at what spies do, is by its very nature secret, confidential. Espionage is amassing information secretly. Okay? Now, normally espionage done by private entities is normally illegal. Okay? But when the state participates in espionage, there are simply three reasons why the state spies, right? We spy out of fear of foreign enemies, okay, national security. We spy out of a concern for internal security. We're not afraid of them out there, we're afraid of us in here. Or we spy to help some private entity within our country get an advantage over some other private entity in another country. Okay? The assumption behind espionage is that it's a dangerous world. The assumption behind espionage is there is no social contract beyond the confines of the nation state or some other entity. Diplomacy is just war by other means. The world is, when we're in a time of peace, there's an assumption by many people who think about the way the world works, it's just waiting for the next war. Okay? And so, therefore, we have to know what everybody is doing around us because of the danger of the people around us. This is sort of the state of nature at the international level, even if we have a social contract at the national level. So the argument is that because of those things, we as a society, we as a nation, any nation must surrender a certain amount of informed consent, and the government must be able to act secretly, hopefully in our interest, but taking into consideration Lord Acton's idea that all power corrupts, and taking into consideration the idea that groups tend to organize for themselves and their own benefits, even within organizations. The question becomes, how do we reconcile a secret government and a democratic government? Okay, and there's a couple of principles that people have been thinking about this for a long time. Okay? I mean, there's the argument of necessity. We need to be able to protect ourselves. But the argument of necessity also works on certain assumptions in a democracy. Minimal amount of secrecy, minimal amount of falsehood, and it should never be disproportionate to the danger. Okay, so we have to take into consideration if the danger is slight but real, then a certain amount of secrecy and espionage may be justified. Okay, but you can't conflate or inflate the danger to justify moving well beyond what is reasonable. Okay? It's a tough game. I mean, how do you measure this? I mean, the old joke, if I told you I would have to kill you, okay? You can't handle the truth. All of those kinds of things. Trust us, we know what we're doing. Okay? So the argument is, there's the tension. How do we know that the state is only what is doing reasonable things to protect us when they don't have to tell us? Okay, I mean, we can hear all the time, as we have heard from the security apparatus in the United States, that what we did, we had to do because of the emergency, right? The Central Intelligence Agency, we found out this summer, was spying on the congressional committee that was established to look in to see if they had exercised too much power in spying on people. Okay? So a committee, which by the way is the least transparent committee in Congress, was investigating our spies, who started investigating them and threatening them. Okay? Spying on U.S. senators, spying on members of congressional committees, threatening members of congressional committees, threatening members of Congress. Okay? Now what's the justification for that? Necessity. Who do you trust in a situation like that? So that's the tension. Have we gone too far? There are literally hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who have a security clearance of top secret or above. Okay? And if they find out things in their job, they can never tell anybody. We have laws in the United States that say if you ever had a top security clearance and you want to write anything, you have to check it first with the spy agencies. Okay? If any of you have ever had the experience of trying to climb on an airplane and suddenly they kick you out of line and don't let you on the airplane, they don't tell you why. All you know is you had a ticket to Los Angeles and now you can't use it. Right? And they won't tell you. Okay? How do you keep a society open, transparent, honest, and fair when you allow the power of the state in the name of security to say, we can't tell you what we're doing. Trust us, we're here to protect you. Okay? And if you don't trust us, we're here to protect you, you can form a committee and investigate us, but if you do, we're going to go after the committee. Okay, therein lies the tension. And added to this, I mean, I was going to go into a lot more detail of that, but that's essentially what the argument is. Okay. Added to this is, we do catch spies. We do find out what spies are doing. We do know a little bit about the intelligence community. We do know the things that they are secretly doing to us. About 60 years ago, there was a very famous scandal in Great Britain when two men named Burgess and McLean turned out to be Soviet spies, and they zipped off to the Soviet Union just before they got caught. And they got zipped off the Soviet Union just before they got caught because one of the other spies, their good friend, who was also a Soviet spy, said, they're about to capture you. Eat it. Okay? Burgess, McLean, and Philby was a disaster for the British Secret Service. Okay? You know, James Bond to bring them back. Okay? Because they seemed so inept. But in retrospect, a lot of interesting things happened as a result of McLean, Burgess, and Philby, including the fact that MI6, which is the British equivalent of the CIA, was investigated by MI5, which is the British equivalent of the FBI. Okay? And what they discovered was that McLean and Philby and Burgess really didn't hurt them very much, hurt their reputation. The suggestion was, as a result of Burgess and McLean, the Soviets got the atomic bomb 2 years earlier than they would have gotten it anyway. Okay? So instead of getting it in 1951, they got it in 1949. I'm not sure how much that has changed the world. Okay? But they did. MI5, the FBI in Britain, decided that they had to chase out all of the Soviet spies in Great Britain. So for about 15 years, they put a massive investigation on this guy that they knew must be a spy, because he'd gone to the Soviet Union to study economics. The guy was Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson was Prime Minister of Great Britain twice. He wasn't a spy. He'd gone to the Soviet Union. The beauty about reading real spy stories is the incredible ineptitude of spies. Right? Think of Snowden, Edward Snowden, right? He released millions and millions of documents because he was a semi-libertarian patriot who thought the United States is going to hell because we're spying on everybody. And he went to his bosses in the intelligence community and says, we've got to cut this out. We're violating all of our principles of freedom. And the bosses said, shut up. So he stole the stuff and he published it. And he published amazing things like, we spy on people. Okay? Go back and read the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War. They went crazy because we came up with all these secret documents. Among the secret documents was, we suspected that the Vietnamese knew we were at war with them. Or you could walk out every morning and watch the damn bombers fly over and blow up your house. Right? So the question is, we surrender a certain amount of freedom, we accept a certain amount of oppression, right? You can't climb on an airplane because your name is wrong. One of my favorite people got bumped on the no-fly out was a guy named Edward M. Kennedy. Okay? He died a couple of years ago after spending 50 years in the United States Senate. His brother was the President of the United States. They wouldn't let him fly, and they wouldn't tell him why. Okay? So, it isn't just you and I that could get bumped off an airplane. Right? Is that a loss of, it's a minor loss of freedom, maybe. Okay? So the question I would ask you to think about, and I'm sorry, this is not the organized presentation and not the detail I wanted to get so you can think about it deeply, is how much freedom do we give up? How much consent do we miss? How much loss of democracy is acceptable when we give it up to these organizations of espionage? If the organizations of espionage, are the organizations of espionage, is the level of spying worth it? Okay? Have we lost more than we gained? Okay? It's simply a zero-sum game. Okay? It's a cost-benefit analysis. How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice to people who are telling us, trust us, we can't tell you why we do it, but we threaten you if you ask too much, so that you can be secure. Okay? For 20 years I've been arguing there's a balance there. I still may argue there's a balance there. It seems, however, as we know what's going on, even in the last year or so, that we may be out of balance. We may have gone too far. Okay? President Obama and his State Department and his Justice Department is going after more journalists for asking more questions than any president probably in American history. The difference may be, however, I say probably, is because even though he's persecuting people for not saying this is where I got the material, he's doing it somewhat publicly, as opposed to maybe some of the early presidents who went after them more secretly. But Obama's a constitutional lawyer. Obama keeps claiming we're doing this for freedom. And Obama has gone after more people, publicly at least, than Richard Nixon or George Bush or Lyndon Johnson. Okay? So if the people we think of as somebody who believes in civil liberties is willing to deny us our civil liberties, okay? How do we feel about somebody like Dick Cheney, who doesn't even make any claims about civil liberties? He just talks about defending the presidential prerogative to protect us, whether we like it or not. That's essentially the argument that I would have made more in more detail had we had more time. And unfortunately, we have a little bit of time for questions or comments. Yes?
Can you expand when you say that Obama is going after the journalists?
I'm sorry?
Can you expand when you say Obama is going after journalists publicly?
Yes, I mean, the current case is a guy, I think his name is Risen, R-I-S-E-N, who has dug up some material. And what they were going after is journalists who are saying, this is happening in this country, and then the spy apparatus, how do you know that? Where did you get this information? The journalist says, I'm protecting my sources, and we're threatening them with jail. Okay. That's what's known as, the chilling effect, right? Nothing will chill you. I mean, if you're a reporter, you're trying to find out the truth to expose it to the American people, nothing is more chilling than, if I publish this, am I going to end up in jail? Right? And so when the state threatens you, and it has a chilling effect that dampens, not only does that say information isn't going to get out, it may even prevent people from saying, I'm not going to do that. I know something, I'm not going to talk. Because even though the American people deserve to know it, I don't want to go to jail. And when the state does that, and the Obama administration does that, and the Bush administration did that, it's the chilling effect on information. How can we make thoughtful decisions based on false information? Yes?
Can you just repeat what you just said about Dick Cheney's argument?
About what?
About Dick Cheney's argument, what you said about, like you literally just said it right before you were talking about the Wandling, like about his
Okay, what I was saying is that there's a chilling effect. Is that what you're talking about, the chilling effect? Before that?
No, Dick Cheney, his stance on.
Oh, Dick
Yeah.
Cheney's view is what he called the unitary idea of the presidency, and that is that once the government had decided that there was a threat, it is the responsibility of the president to do anything and everything they want to fight that threat. And that supersedes, Oliver North, who was one of my favorite all-time internal spies, because he was such a great deal. He was absolutely hysterically funny in a really scary, different kind of way. Oliver North used to say there's a higher law than the Constitution, I believe, and therefore I can violate the law. Cheney has formalized it into this theory that says the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief. And so as Commander-in-Chief, anything he does to protect the country is valid, and that supersedes all other principles like the First Amendment. Yes, sir.
You were speaking before about journalism.
Yes.
Journalism today, right? Do you think there's the same quality of journalists as there was when Woodward and Bernstein versus there is today?
the same kind of
Quality of journalism, like Woodward and Bernstein.
I think there's some absolutely outstanding journalists working today. And I wrote my doctoral dissertation about Watergate, so I'm steeped in Bernstein and Woodward. And they're good. But do we have people that are willing to go out on a limb to try and get the story? Yes. The thing that is different today because we have 24-hour news cycles. Okay, so every story has to be told 35 times over 24 hours. We have, 10 minutes of news a day and 24 hours to fill in. We don't have the same tolerance for slow, methodical research. I don't know if you've read All the President's Men, but they worked on getting out the story about Watergate for months and months and months. And they would go back and say, I'm not there yet, but I've got a great story, but I'm not going to publish it until I know it's right. Nowadays, we don't have a whole lot of time. You get out the story quickly because if you don't, social media will. That doesn't mean they're not good reporters out there. It means that the news industry doesn't allow that level of detail very often. It used to be better to get it right than to get it fast. Now it's better to get it fast than to worry about the rest later. So I think that is a problem, especially investigative journalists of this type, because it can take years to uncover this stuff. And it's not a quick fix to do something. Yes?
So Andy, I had a much easier time with this question personally before, the question of how much privacy should we give up in government protection. Before we had groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and et cetera. And so I'm just curious, how much privacy do you think we should give up for government protection? What's your personal opinion?
Well, yeah, I think the thing is that what we have to ask questions of is, how does giving up our privacy, if we're not giving up our privacy, make us any safer against a group like ISIS? I mean, the point is there's this automatic assumption that if we were just a little more clever with our spies, hundreds of years of European cultural imperialism in the Middle East could be overcome. Okay? I mean, one of the things that the CIA, or that MI5 did, was that they trained counterinsurgents in Albania to overthrow the Albanian communists in the 1950s. Okay? The Albanian regime was a horrible regime. The trainers spoke no Albanian. They dropped the Albanians in behind lines. The Albanians completely misunderstood what they had been trained to do, so they ended up dead. Okay, that may sound familiar to a few of you who've read American history. That's the Bay of Pigs. We did exactly the same thing in Cuba. So the idea is, well, are there real threats in the world? Yes. How far does espionage take us in fighting those real threats. And that's a question that we become we so believe that espionage is valuable, we never step back and say, I mean, is ISIS a secret organization? Right? I mean, do we know what they want? I mean, they publish it in social media every day, right? The Yazidis, right? You can convert, you can leave, or you can die. Okay, I know that, right? So it isn't a question of, is it a dangerous world? The answer is clearly yes. It's a question of giving up our rights to these spy agencies, which may lead to corruption on their part. Is it making us safer or not? And I think that's where I would look at that particular question, is what are we getting for it? And I will admit, I have the same problem with you and everybody else has in the room. It's secret. You know, we don't know. You know, has the CIA really protected us from all those things that we see in, Tom Clancy novels? I sort of doubt it because, as I said, I wrote my dissertation about Watergate and Iran-Contra. So I've looked deeply into our spies. And as a group, if it wasn't so tragic, they're actually pretty funny. I mean, some of the things we have done is just, it's comical in the extreme. And it sort of gets back to that old notion, you end up with something like, again, Oliver North, who many of you probably don't remember, which is too bad because he had a talk show. His was the most valuable talk show on right-wing radio. Because he always said, when the cops come in your house, shoot them in the face because they wear bulletproof vests. See, that's the kind of, useful knowledge you don't get from your average right-wing radio wacko. Okay? You had a kind of special kind of thing. And he was the guy who played a huge role in the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, 1987. And somebody said, why would you pick a lunatic like Oliver North? And the obvious answer is, who else is going to try and overthrow the government? Right? So there's the danger of these people. I mean, I will admit that I eventually studied Iran-Contra and Watergate because it was so much fun. Studying Richard Nixon, actually, I know you've all heard of it. We don't know much about it, but it's Woody Allen said years ago, he's the kind of guy that every time he left the White House, the Secret Service got it silver to see if he'd stolen it. But he's fun, right? These guys are extremely fun in a very dangerous sort of sick sort of way. Tim?
Andy, I was wondering if you could maybe say, I liked you before you said it's screening. You said we need to screen in a democracy sometimes.
Right.
But I was thinking of when I was at the age of the people in this room, most of them anyway, it was right around the time that the church report came out about all the CIA activities. And I wonder if you could comment for them, like what they can do to make sure that story you told about the intelligence agency being spied upon by the intelligence, the subcommittee being spied upon, that's terrifying. So
yes.
What can we do as citizens in a democracy besides screening, or is it screening the best thing that we can do to help our government actually keep oversight over this?
I mean,
the church trying to do.
I mean, it is a courageous act to stand up against the excessive force of the government. But it does work. We know it takes a long time, but if you get kicked off of an airplane, if you are persistent, you can actually find out why eventually. And sometimes, if you're on the no-fly list, by screaming at the government long enough, you can get to fly on an airplane again. That may not seem like much, but it means that the government can be receptive to pressure. I mean, I think the thing is that every time you hear of government overreach, you should ask the question, what's that about? Right? You can accept a kind of negative notion, okay, all power corrupts. But at the same time, the reason it doesn't get worse is you can push back. And screaming is not the only thing to do. But sometimes it is effective to raise your voice, to say, we're not going to put up with it anymore. We're going to push back. It's also dangerous sometimes. You have to be careful, right? I mean, the militarization, Ferguson, Missouri is a key example, right? When you have anti-personnel machinery, okay, for people exercising their First Amendment rights. It's scary. Okay? And so it is, there's a danger, but you have to kind of think about what's the payoff, what's the cost. Right? I mean, I understand why people don't raise their hands in certain situations, because if you do, somebody's going to smack you on the head. You know, but sometimes it becomes so odious you kind of have to do it. I don't know, I mean, if we had more time, we could talk about our former colleague on this campus, Mario Savio, who said in 1964, sometimes the machine becomes so odious, we have no alternative than to try and get in the cogs of the machine and stop.
We'll get that on my top.
Huh? Okay. I mean, so you know, listen to Mario and see if Mario, what he's saying, has any kind of justification. You know, if you walk out in our quad, and there's a little circle of free speech dedicated to Mario Savio. So that's something you can do. You can stand up and you can say, I'm not going to deal with this, but take into consideration. Every time you raise your hand, there's the element of risk. Right? If you raise your hand in class, there's the element of risk. You might ask what seems like a silly question. Okay? Is it worth it to find out something? Is it worth it to stand up? So that's all I can, suggest.
All right, want to take one more question?
There is another question I would take. Oh, yes.
So when you say like stand up and speak, so like you say the Occupy movement is trying to do that, fight against the 1%, and we are the 99%. Do you think it's because their message wasn't clear, or like, because I feel like that's a perfect example of a lot of people coming together all across the country and having like a message, but then it wasn't successful. Like, I know you say revolutionaries have to be successful to.
But revolutions are on a timeline, right? I mean, the Occupy movement is not over. I was at various Occupy events. I was working in Sacramento, and the Occupy movement in Sacramento was at Cesar Chavez Plaza, right across from the hotel where I was staying. And I go out there each night, and we were feeding the homeless. The park was 10 times cleaner when they left than when they got there. They would have these big talks, but I got to admit, as somebody who's done a lot of organizing in my life, allowing everybody to speak in a circle is not efficient. Okay, but it's empowering. We don't know where it's going to end up. About is there going to be a fight against the super rich by the rest of us or not? The Occupy movement didn't succeed in bringing down the country, but I don't know and I'm not sure I wanted them to, because they're a little chaotic. If you believe that something has to be changed, this goes back to the question here about the media. We're short-time people. Geez, I've been at this for 3 whole days. How come things aren't better? Working to better society is a really long slog. And when you're trying to better societies in countries that have gone through oppression for centuries and centuries, it's a really long slog. Okay? Samuel Adams started working on the American Revolution in about 1755. Okay? They didn't even try to arrest him until 1775, because nobody noticed. But he was busting his butt.
Please thank Professor